Chapters 38 through 41 of the Autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini, Volume 1, translated by John Addington Symonds, Chapters 38 through 41. 38. I shall skip over some intervening circumstances, and tell how Pope Clement, wishing to save the tiaras and the whole collection of the great jewels of the Apostolic Camera, had me called, and the Cavalierino in a room alone. This Cavalierino had been a groom in the stable of Filippo Strozzi. He was French, and a person of the lowest birth, but being a most faithful servant, the Pope had made him very rich, and confided in him like himself. So the Pope, the Cavaliere, and I, being shut up together, they laid before me the tiaras and jewels of the regalia, and his Holiness ordered me to take all the gems out of their gold settings. This I accordingly did. Afterwards I wrapped them separately up in bits of paper, and we sewed them into the linings of the Pope's and the Cavaliere's clothes. Then they gave me all the gold, which weighed about 200 pounds, and bade me melt it down as secretly as I was able. I went up to the Angel, where I had my lodging, and could lock the door so as to be free from interruption. There I built a little draught furnace of bricks, with a largish pot, shaped like an open dish, at the bottom of it, and throwing the gold upon the coals, it gradually sank through and dropped into the pan. While the furnace was working, I never left off watching how to annoy our enemies, and as their trenches were less than a stone's throw right below us, I was able to inflict considerable damage on them with some useless missiles, of which there were several piles, forming the old munition of the castle. I chose a swivel and a falconet, which were both a little damaged in the muzzle, and filled them with the projectiles I have mentioned. When I fired my guns, they hurtled down like mad, occasioning all sorts of unexpected mischief in the trenches. Accordingly I kept those pieces always going at the same time that the gold was being melted down, and a little before vespers I noticed some one coming along the margin of the trench on muleback. The mule was trotting very quickly, and the man was talking to the soldiers in the trenches. I took the precaution of discharging my artillery just before he came to the immediate opposite, and so, making a good calculation, I hit my mark. One of the fragments struck him in the face; the rest were scattered on the mule, which fell dead. A tremendous uproar rose from the trench; I opened fire with my other piece, doing them a great hurt. The man turned out to be the Prince of Orange, who was carried through the trenches to a certain tavern in the neighbourhood, whither in a short while all the chief folk of the army came together. When Pope Clement heard what I had done, he sent at once to call for me, and inquired into the circumstances. I related the whole, and added that the man must have been of the greatest consequence, because the inn to which they carried him had been immediately filled by all the chiefs of the army, so far at least as I could judge. The Pope, with a shrewd instinct, sent for Messer Antonio Santacroce, the nobleman who, as I have said, was chief and commander of the gunners. He bade him order all us bombardiers to point our pieces, which were very numerous, in one mass upon the house, and to discharge them all together upon the signal of an arquebuse being fired. He judged that if we killed the generals, the army, which was already almost on the point of breaking up, would take flight. God perhaps had heard the prayers they kept continually making, and meant to rid them in this manner of these impious scoundrels. We put our cannon in order at the command of Santa Croce, and waited for the signal. But when Cardinal Orsini became aware of what was going forward, he began to expostulate with the Pope, protesting that the thing by no means ought to happen, seeing they were on the point of concluding an accommodation, and that if the generals were killed, the rabble of the troops without a leader would storm the castle and complete their utter ruin. Consequently they could by no means allow the Pope's plan to be carried out. The poor Pope, in despair, seeing himself assassinated both inside the castle and without, said that he left them to arrange it. On this our orders were countermanded; but I, who chafed against the leash, when I knew that they were coming round to bid me stop from firing, let blaze one of my demi cannons, and struck a pillar in the courtyard of the house, around which I saw a crowd of people clustering. This shot did such damage to the enemy that it was like to have made them evacuate the house. Cardinal Orsini was absolutely for having me hanged or put to death, but the Pope took up my cause with spirit. The high words that passed between them, though I well know what they are, I will not here relate, because I make no profession of writing history. It is enough for me to occupy myself with my own affairs. 39. After I had melted down the gold, I took it to the Pope, who thanked me cordially for what I had done, and ordered the Cavalierino to give me 25 crowns, apologizing to me for his inability to give me more. A few days afterwards the articles of peace were signed. I went with 300 comrades in the train of Signor Orazio Baglioni toward Perugia, and there he wished to make me captain of the company, but I was unwilling at the moment, saying that I wanted first to go and see my father, and to redeem the ban which was still in force against me at Florence. Signor Orazio told me that he had been appointed general of the Florentines, and Ser Pier Mario Dell'Otto, the envoy from Florence, was with him, to whom he specially recommended me as his man. In course of time I came to Florence in the company of several comrades. The plague was raging with indescribable fury. When I reached home, I found my good father, who thought either that I must have been killed in the sack of Rome, or else that I should come back to him a beggar. However, I entirely defeated both these expectations, for I was alive, with plenty of money, a fellow to wait on me, and a good horse. My joy on greeting the old man was so intense, that while he embraced and kissed me, I thought that I must die upon the spot. After I had narrated all the devilries of that dreadful sack, and had given him a good quantity of crowns which I had gained by my soldiering, and when we had exchanged our tokens of affection, he went off to the Eight to redeem my ban. It so happened that one of those magistrates who sentenced me was now again a member of the board. It was the very man who had so inconsiderately told my father he meant to march me out into the country with the lances. My father took this opportunity of addressing him with some meaning words, in order to mark his revenge, relying on the favour which Orazio Baglioni showed me. Matters standing thus, I told my father how Signor Orazio had appointed me captain, and that I ought to begin to think of enlisting my company. At these words the poor old man was greatly disturbed, and begged me, for God's sake, not to turn my thoughts to such an enterprise, although he knew I should be fit for this or yet a greater business; adding that his other son, my brother, was already a most valiant soldier, and that I ought to pursue the noble art in which I had laboured so many years, and with such diligence of study. Although I promised to obey him, he reflected, like a man of sense, that if Signor Orazio came to Florence I could not withdraw myself from military service, partly because I had passed my word, as well as for other reasons. He therefore thought of a good expedient for sending me away, and spoke to me as follows: "O my dear son, the plague in this town is raging with immitigable violence, and I am always fancying you will come home infected with it. I remember, when I was a young man, that I went to Mantua, where I was very kindly received, and stayed there several years. I pray and command you, for the love of me, to pack off and go thither, and I would have you do this to day rather than to morrow." 40. I had always taken pleasure in seeing the world, and having never been to Mantua, I went there very willingly. Of the money I had brought to Florence, I left the greater part with my good father, promising to help him wherever I might be, and confiding him to the care of my elder sister. Her name was Cosa, and since she never cared to marry, she was admitted as a nun in Santa Orsola; but she put off taking the veil, in order to keep house for our old father, and to look after my younger sister, who was married to one Bartolommeo, a surgeon. So then, leaving home with my father's blessing, I mounted my good horse, and rode off on it to Mantua. It would take too long to describe that little journey in detail. The whole world being darkened over with plague and war, I had the greatest difficulty in reaching Mantua. However, in the end, I got there, and looked about for work to do, which I obtained from a Maestro Niccolò of Milan, goldsmith to the Duke of Mantua. Having thus settled down to work, I went after 2 days of work to visit Messer Guglielmo Romano, that most excellent painter, of whom I have already spoken, and my very good friend. He received me with the tenderest caresses, and took it very ill that I had not dismounted at his house. He was living like a lord, and executing a great work for the Duke outside the city gates, in a place called Del Te. It was a vast and prodigious undertaking, as may still, I suppose, be seen by those who go there. Messer Guglielmo lost no time in speaking of me to the Duke in terms of the warmest praise. That prince commissioned me to make a model for a reliquary, to hold the blood of Christ, which they have there, and say was brought to them by Longinus. Then he turned to Guglielmo, bidding him to supply me with a design for it. To this Giulio replied: "My lord, Benvenuto is a man who does not need other people's sketches, as your Excellency will be very well able to judge when you shall see his model." I set hand to the work, and made a drawing for the reliquary, well adapted to contain the sacred phial. Then I made a little waxen model of the cover. This was a seated Christ, supporting his great cross aloft with the left hand, while he seemed to lean against it, and with the fingers of his right hand he appeared to be opening the wound in his side. When it was finished, it pleased the Duke so much that he heaped favours on me, and gave me to understand he would keep me in his service with such appointments as should enable me to live in affluence. Meanwhile I had paid my duty to the Cardinal, his brother, who begged the Duke to allow me to make the pontifical seat of his most reverend lordship. This I began, but while I was working at it I caught a quartan fever. During each access of this fever I was thrown into delirium, when I cursed Mantua and its master and whoever stayed there at his own liking. These words were reported to the Duke by the Milanese goldsmith, who had not omitted to notice that the Duke wanted to employ me. When the Prince heard the ravings of my sickness, he flew into a passion against me, and I being out of temper with Mantua, our bad feeling was reciprocal. The seal was finished after 4 months, together with several other little pieces I made for the Duke under the name of the Cardinal. His Reverence paid me well, and bade me return to Rome, to that marvellous city where we had made acquaintance. I quitted Mantua with a good sum of crowns, and reached Skoverno, where the most valiant General Giovanni had been killed. Here I had a slight relapse of fever, which did not interrupt my journey, and coming now to an end it never returned on me again. When I arrived at Florence, I hoped to find my dear father, and knocking at the door, a hump backed woman in a fury showed her face at the window. She drove me off with a torrent of abuse, screaming that the sight of me was a consumption to her. To this misshapen hag I shouted: "Ho! tell me, cross-grained hunchback, is there no other face to see here but your ugly visage? No, and bad luck to you." Whereupon I answered in a loud voice: "In less than 2 hours it may never vex us more." Attracted by this dispute, a neighbour put her head out, from whom I learned that my father and all the people in the house had died of the plague. As I had partly guessed it might be so, my grief was not so great as it would otherwise have been. The woman afterwards told me that only my sister Liperata had escaped, and that she had taken refuge with a pious lady named Monna Andrea de Bellacci. I took my way from thence to the inn, and met by accident a very dear friend of mine, Giovanni Rigogli. Dismounting at his house, we proceeded to the piazza, where I received intelligence that my brother was alive, and went to find him at the house of a friend of his called Bertino Aldobrandini. On meeting, we made demonstrations of the most passionate affection, for he had heard that I was dead, and I had heard that he was dead, and so our joy at embracing one another was extravagant. Then he broke out into a loud fit of laughter, and said: "Come, brother, I will take you where I'm sure you'd never guess. You must know that I have given our sister Liperata away again in marriage, and she holds it for absolute certain that you are dead." On our way we told each other all the wonderful adventures we had met with, and when we reached the house where our sister dwelt, the surprise of seeing me alive threw her into a fainting fit, and she fell senseless in my arms. Had not my brother been present, her speechlessness and sudden seizure must have made her husband imagine I was some one different from a brother, as indeed at first it did. Cecchino, however, explained matters, and busied himself in helping the swooning woman, who soon came to. Then, after shedding some tears for father, sister, husband, and a little son whom she had lost, she began to get the supper ready, and during our merry meeting all that evening we talked no more about dead folk, but rather discoursed gaily about weddings. Then with gladness and great enjoyment we brought our supper party to an end. XLI On the entreaty of my brother and sister, I remained at Florence, though my own inclination led me to return to Rome. The dear friend also, who had helped me in some of my earlier troubles, as I have narrated, I mean Piero, son of Giovanni Landi, he too advised me to make some stay in Florence, for the Medici were in exile, that is to say, Signor Ippolito and Signor Alessandro, who were afterwards respectively Cardinal and Duke of Florence, and he judged it would be well for me to wait and see what happened. At that time there arrived in Florence a Sienese, called Girolamo Maretti, who had lived long in Turkey and was a man of lively intellect. He came to my shop, and commissioned me to make a golden medal to be worn in the hat. The subject was to be Hercules wrenching the lion's mouth. While I was working at this piece, Michael Angelo Buonarroti came oftentimes to see it. I had spent infinite pains upon the design, so that the attitude of the figure and the fierce passion of the beast were executed in quite a different style from that of any craftsman who had hitherto attempted such groups. This, together with the fact that the special branch of art was totally unknown to Michael Angelo, made the divine master give such praises to my work that I felt incredibly inspired for further effort. However, I found little else to do but jewel setting, and though I gained more thus than in any other way, yet I was dissatisfied, for I would fain have been employed upon some higher task than that of setting precious stones. Just then I met with Federigo Ginori, a young man of a very lofty spirit. He had lived some years in Naples, and being endowed with great charms of person and presence, had been the lover of a Neapolitan princess. He wanted to have a medal made, with Atlas bearing the world upon his shoulders, and applied to Michelangelo for a design. Michelangelo made this answer: "Go and find out a young goldsmith named Benvenuto; he will serve you admirably, and certainly he does not stand in need of sketches by me. However, to prevent your thinking that I want to save myself the trouble of so slight a matter, I will gladly sketch you something; but meanwhile speak to Benvenuto, and let him also make a model; he can then execute the better of the two designs." Federigo Ginori came to me, and told me what he wanted, adding thereto how Michelangelo had praised me, and how he had suggested I should make a waxen model, while he undertook to supply a sketch. The words of that great man so heartened me, that I set myself to work at once with eagerness upon the model; and when I had finished it, a painter who was intimate with Michelangelo, called Giuliano Bugiardini, brought me the drawing of Atlas. On the same occasion I showed Giuliano my little model in wax, which was very different from Michelangelo's drawing; and Federigo, in concert with Bugiardini, agreed that I should work upon my model. So I took it in hand, and when Michelangelo saw it, he praised me to the skies. This was a figure, as I have said, chiselled on a plate of gold; Atlas had the heaven upon his back, made out of a crystal ball, engraved with the zodiac upon a field of lapis lazuli. The whole composition produced an indescribably fine effect, and under it ran the legend Summa Tullis Juvat. Federigo was so thoroughly well pleased that he paid me very liberally. Luigi Alamanni was at that time in Florence. Federigo Ginori, who enjoyed his friendship, brought him often to my workshop, and through this introduction we became very intimate together. Chapter 38 through 41. Chapters 42 through 45 of the Autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini, Volume 1, translated by John Addington Symonds, Chapter 42 through 45. 42. Pope Clement had now declared war upon the city of Florence, which thereupon was put in a state of defence; and the militia being organized in each quarter of the town, I too received orders to serve in my turn. I provided myself with a rich outfit, and went about with the highest nobility of Florence, who showed a unanimous desire to fight for the defence of our liberties. Meanwhile the speeches which are usual upon such occasions were made in every quarter; the young men met together more than was their wont, and everywhere we had but one topic of conversation. It happened one day, about noon, that a crowd of tall men and lusty young fellows, the first in the city, were assembled in my workshop, when a letter from Rome was put into my hands. It came from a man called Maestro Giacopini della Barca. His real name was Jacopo della Scurini, but they called him della Barca in Rome, because he kept a ferry boat upon the Tiber between Ponte Sisto and Ponte Sant'Angelo. He was a person of considerable talent, distinguished by his pleasantries and striking conversation, and he had formerly been a designer of patterns for the cloth weavers in Florence. This man was intimate with the Pope, who took great pleasure in hearing him talk. Being one day engaged in conversation, they touched upon the sack and the defence of the castle. This brought me to the Pope's mind, and he spoke of me in the very highest terms, adding that if he knew where I was, he should be glad to get me back. Maestro Jacopo said I was in Florence, whereupon the Pope bade the man write and tell me to return to him. The letter I have mentioned was to the effect that I should do well if I resumed the service of Clement, and that this was sure to turn out to my advantage. The young men who were present were curious to know what the letter contained, wherefore I concealed it as well as I could. Afterwards I wrote to Maestro Jacopo, begging him by no means, whether for good or evil, to write to me again. He, however, grew more obstinate in his officiousness, and wrote me another letter, so extravagantly worded, that if it had been seen, I should have got into serious trouble. The substance of it was that the Pope required me to come at once, wanting to employ me on a work of the greatest consequence; also that if I wished to act aright, I ought to throw up everything, and not to stand against a Pope in the party of those hare-brained radicals. This letter, when I read it, put me in such a fright that I went to seek my dear friend Piero Landi. Directly he set his eyes on me, he asked what accident had happened to upset me so. I told my friend that it was quite impossible for me to explain what lay upon my mind, and what was causing me this trouble; only I entreated him to take the keys I gave him, and to return the gems and gold in my drawers to such and such persons, whose names he would find inscribed upon my memorandum book. Next I begged him to pack up the furniture of my house, and keep account of it with his usual loving kindness, and in a few days he should hear where I was. The prudent young man, guessing perhaps pretty nearly how the matter stood, replied, "My brother, go your way quickly, then write to me, and have no further care about your things." I did as he advised. He was the most loyal friend, the wisest, the most worthy, the most discreet, the most affectionate that I have ever known. I left Florence and went to Rome, and from there I wrote to him. XLIII Upon my arrival at Rome, I found several of my former friends, by whom I was very well received and kindly entertained. No time was lost before I set myself to work at things which brought me profit, but were not notable enough to be described. There was a fine old man, a goldsmith, called Raffaello del Moro, who had considerable reputation in the trade, and was to boot a very worthy fellow. He begged me to consent to enter his workshop, saying he had some commissions of importance to execute, on which high profits might be looked for; so I accepted his proposal with good will. More than 10 days had elapsed, and I had not presented myself to Maestro Jacopino della Barca. Meeting me one day by accident, he gave me a hearty welcome, and asked me how long I had been in Rome. When I told him I had been there about a fortnight, he took it very ill, and said that I showed little esteem for a Pope who urgently compelled him to write 3 times for me. I, who had taken his persistence in the matter still more ill, made no reply, but swallowed down my irritation. The man, who suffered from a flux of words, began one of his long yarns, and went on talking, till at last, when I saw him tired out, I merely said that he might bring me to the Pope when he saw fit. He answered that any time would do for him, and I, that I was always ready. So we took our way toward the palace. It was a Maundy Thursday, and when we reached the apartments of the Pope, he being known there, and I expected, we were at once admitted. The Pope was in bed, suffering from a slight indisposition, and he had with him Messer Jacopi Salviati and the Archbishop of Capua. When the Pope set eyes on me, he was exceedingly glad. I kissed his feet, and then as humbly as I could, drew near to him, which let him understand that I had things of consequence to utter. On this he waved his hand, and the 2 prelates retired to a distance from us. I began at once to speak. "Most blessed Father, from the time of the sack up to this hour, I have never been able to confess or to communicate, because they refused me absolution. The case is this. When I melted down the gold and worked at the unsetting of those jewels, your Holiness ordered the Cavalierino to give me a modest reward for my labours, of which I received nothing, but on the contrary he rather paid me with abuse. When then I ascended to the chamber where I had melted down the gold, and washed the ashes, I found about 1.5 pounds of gold in tiny grains like millet seeds; and inasmuch as I had not money enough to take me home respectably, I thought I would avail myself of this, and give it back again when opportunity should offer. Now I am here at the feet of your Holiness, who is the only true confessor. I entreat you to do me the favour of granting me indulgence, so that I may be able to confess and communicate, and by the grace of your Holiness regain the grace of my Lord God." Upon this the Pope, with a scarcely perceptible sigh, remembering perhaps his former trials, spoke as follows: "Benvenuto, I thoroughly believe what you tell me, It is in my power to absolve you of any unbecoming deed you may have done, and what is more, I have the will. So then, speak out with frankness and perfect confidence, for if you had taken the value of a whole tiara, I am quite ready to pardon you." Thereupon I answered: "I took nothing, most blessed Father, but what I have confessed, and this did not amount to the value of 140 ducats, for that was the sum I received from the mint in Perugia, and with it I went home to comfort my poor old father." The Pope said: "Your father has been as virtuous, good, and worthy a man as was ever born, and you have not degenerated from him. I am very sorry that the money was so little, but, such as you say it was, I make you a present of it, and give you my full pardon. Assure your confessor of this, if there is nothing else upon your conscience which concerns me. Afterwards, when you have confessed and communicated, you shall present yourself to me again, and it will be to your advantage." When I parted from the Pope, Messer Jacopo and the Archbishop approached, and the Pope spoke to them in the highest terms imaginable about me. He said that he had confessed and absolved me; then he commissioned the Archbishop of Capua to send for me and ask if I had any other need beyond this matter, giving him full leave to absolve me amply, and bidding him, moreover, treat me with the utmost kindness. While I was walking away with Maestro Giacopino, he asked me very inquisitively what was the close and lengthy conversation I had with his Holiness. After he had repeated the question more than twice, I said that I did not mean to tell him, because they were matters with which he had nothing to do, and therefore he need not go on asking me. Then I went to do what had been agreed on with the Pope, and after the 2 festivals were over, I again presented myself before his Holiness. He received me even better than before, and said: "If you had come a little earlier to Rome, I should have commissioned you to restore my 2 tiaras, which were pulled to pieces in the castle. These, however, with the exception of the gems, are objects of little artistic interest; so I will employ you on a piece of the very greatest consequence, where you will be able to exhibit all your talents. It is a button for my priest's cope, which has to be made round like a trencher, and as big as a little trencher, 1/3 of a cubit wide. Upon this I want you to represent God the Father in half relief, and in the middle to set that magnificent big diamond, which you remember, together with several other gems of the greatest value. Caradosso began to make me one, but did not finish it; I want yours to be finished quickly, so that I may enjoy the use of it a little while. Go, then, and make me a fine model." He had all the jewels shown to me, and then I went off like a shot to set myself to work. XLIV DURING the time when Florence was besieged, Federigo Ginori, for whom I made that medal of Atlas, died of consumption, and the medal came into the hands of Messer Luigi Alamanni, who, after a little while, took it to present in person to Francis, King of France, accompanied by some of his own finest compositions. The King was exceedingly delighted with the gift; whereupon Messer Luigi told his Majesty so much about my personal qualities as well as my art, and spoke so favourably, that the King expressed a wish to know me. Meanwhile I pushed my model for the button forward with all the diligence I could, constructing it exactly of the size which the jewel itself was meant to have. In the trade of the goldsmiths it roused considerable jealousy among those who thought they were capable of matching it. A certain Micheletto had just come to Rome; he was very clever at engraving cornelians, and was moreover a most intelligent jeweller, an old man of great celebrity. He had been employed upon the Pope's tiaras, and while I was working at my model he wondered much that I had not applied to him, being as he was a man of intelligence and of large credit with the Pope. At last, when he saw that I was not coming to him, he came to me, and asked me what I was about. "What the Pope has ordered me," I answered. Then he said: "The Pope has commissioned me to superintend everything which is being made for his Holiness." I only replied that I would ask the Pope, and then should know what answer I ought to give him. He told me that I should repent, and departing in anger, had an interview with all the masters of the art; they deliberated on the matter, and charged Michele with the conduct of the whole affair. As was to be expected from a person of his talents, he ordered more than 30 drawings to be made, all differing in their details, for the piece the Pope had commissioned. Having already access to his Holiness's ear, he took into his council another jeweller, named Pompeo, a Milanese, who was in favour with the Pope, and related to Messer Traiano, the first chamberlain of the court. These 2 together, then, began to insinuate they had seen my model, and did not think me up to a work of such extraordinary import. The Pope replied that he would also have to see it, and that if he then found me unfit for the purpose, he should look around for one who was fit. both of them put in that they had several excellent designs ready; to which the Pope made answer, that he was very pleased to hear it, but that he did not care to look at them till I had completed my model; afterwards he would take them all into consideration at the same time. After a few days I finished my model, and took it to the Pope one morning, when Messer Traiano made me wait till he had sent for Micheletto and Pompeo, bidding them make haste and bring their drawings. On their arrival we were introduced, and Micheletto and Pompeo immediately unrolled their papers, which the Pope inspected. The draughtsmen who had been employed were not in the jeweller's trade, and therefore knew nothing about giving their right place to precious stones, and jewellers, on their side, had not shown them how; for I ought to say that a jeweller, when he has to work with figures, must of necessity understand design, else he cannot produce anything worth looking at; and so it turned out that all of them had stuck that famous diamond in the middle of the breast of God the Father. The Pope, who was an excellent connoisseur, observing this mistake, approved of none of them; and when he had looked at about 10, he flung the rest down, and said to me, who was standing at a distance, "Now show me your model, Benvenuto, so that I may see if you have made the same mistake as these fellows." I came forward and opened a little round box, whereupon one would have thought that a light from heaven had struck the Pope's eyes. He cried aloud: "If you had been in my own body, you could not have done it better, as this proves. Those men there have found the right way to bring shame upon themselves." A crowd of great lords pressing round, the Pope pointed out the difference between my model and the drawings. When he had sufficiently commended it, the others standing terrified and stupid before him, he turned to me and said: "I am only afraid of one thing, and that is of the utmost consequence. Friend Benvenuto, wax is easy to work in; the real difficulty is to execute this in gold." To those words I answered, without moment's hesitation: "Most blessed Father, if I do not work it 10 times better than the model, let it be agreed beforehand that you pay me nothing." When they heard this, the noblemen made a great stir, crying out that I was promising too much. Among them was an eminent philosopher, who spoke out in my favour. From the fine physiognomy and bodily symmetry which I observed in this young man, I predict that he will accomplish what he says, and think that he will even go beyond it. The Pope put in: "And this is my opinion also." Then he called his chamberlain, Messer Traiano, and bade him bring 500 golden ducats of the Camera. While we were waiting for the money, the Pope turned once more to gaze at leisure on the dexterous device I had employed for combining the diamond with the figure of God the Father. I had put the diamond exactly in the centre of the piece, and above it God the Father was shown seated, leaning nobly in a sideways attitude, which made a perfect composition, and did not interfere with the stone's effect. Lifting his right hand, he was in the act of giving the benediction. Below the diamond I had placed 3 children, who, with their arms upraised, were supporting the jewel. One of them, in the middle, was in full relief, the other 2 in half relief. All around I set a crowd of cherubs, in divers attitudes, adapted to the other gems. A mantle undulated to the wind about the figure of God the Father, from the folds of which cherubs peeped out, and there were other ornaments besides which made a very beautiful effect. The work was executed in white stucco on a black stone. When the money came, the Pope gave it to me with his own hand, and begged me in the most winning terms to let him have it finished in his own days, adding that this should be to my advantage. 45. I took the money and the model home, and was in the utmost impatience to begin my work. After I had laboured diligently for 8 days, the Pope sent word by one of his chamberlains, a very great gentleman of Bologna, that I was to come to him and bring what I had got in hand. On the way, the chamberlain, who was the most gentle mannered person in the Roman court, told me that the Pope not only wanted to see what I was doing, but also intended to entrust me with another task of the highest consequence, which was, in fact, to furnish dies for the money of the mint, and bade me arm myself beforehand with the answer I should give. In short, he wished me to be prepared, and therefore he had spoken. When we came into the presence I lost no time in exhibiting the golden plate, upon which I had as yet carved nothing but my figure of God the Father; but this, though only in the rough, displayed a grander style than that of the waxen model. The Pope regarded it with stupefaction, and exclaimed: "From this moment forward I will believe everything you say." Then, loading me with marks of favour, he added: "It is my intention to give you another commission, which, if you feel competent to execute it, I shall have no less at heart than this, or more." He proceeded to tell me that he wished to make dies for the coinage of his realm, and asked if I had ever tried my hand at such things, and if I had the courage to attempt them. I answered that of courage for the task I had no lack, and that I had seen how dies were made, but that I had not ever made any. There was in the presence a certain Messer Tommaso, of Prato, his Holiness's Datary, and this man, being a friend of my enemies, put in: "Most blessed Father, the favours you are showering upon this young man, and he by nature so extremely overbold, are enough to make him promise you a new world. You have already given him one great task, and now, by adding a greater, you are like to make them clash together." The Pope, in a rage, turned round on him, and told him to mind his own business. Then he commanded me to make the model for a broad doubloon of gold, upon which he wanted a naked Christ with his hands tied, and the inscription Ecce Homo. The reverse was to have a Pope and Emperor in the act of propping up a cross which seemed to fall, and this legend: Unus spiritus et una fides erat in eis. After the Pope had ordered this handsome coin, Bandinello the sculptor came up; he had not yet been made a knight, and with his wonted presumption muffled up in ignorance, said: "For these goldsmiths one must make drawings for such fine things as that." I turned round upon him in a moment, and cried out that I did not want his drawings for my art, but that I hoped before very long to give his art some trouble by my drawings. The Pope expressed high satisfaction at these words, and turning to me, said: "Go then, my Benvenuto, and devote yourself with spirit to my service, and do not lend an ear to the chattering of these silly fellows." So I went off, and very quickly made 2 dies of steel; then I stamped a coin in gold, and one Sunday after dinner took the coin and the dies to the Pope, who, when he saw the piece, was astonished and greatly gratified, not only because my work pleased him excessively, but also because of the rapidity with which I had performed it. For the further satisfaction and amazement of his Holiness, I had brought with me all the old coins which in former times had been made by those able men who served Popes Giulio and Leo; and when I noticed that mine pleased him far better, I drew forth from my bosom a patent, in which I prayed for the post of stamp master in the Mint. This place was worth 6 golden crowns a month, in addition to the dies, which were paid at the rate of a ducat for 3 by the Master of the Mint. The Pope took my patent and handed it to the Datary, telling him to lose no time in dispatching the business. The Datary began to put it in his pocket, saying: "Most blessed Father, your Holiness ought not to go so fast; these are matters which deserve some reflection." To this the Pope replied: "I have heard what you have got to say; give me here that patent." He took it, and signed it at once, with his own hand; then, giving it back, added: "Now you have no answer left; see that you dispatch it at once, for this is my pleasure, and Benvenuto's shoes are worth the eyes of all those other blockheads." So, having thanked his Holiness, I went back, rejoicing above measure, to my work. Chapters 42 through 45. 46 through 51 of the Autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini, Volume 1, translated by John Addington Symonds, Chapters 46 through 51. 46. I was still working in the shop of Raffaello del Moro. This worthy man had a very beautiful young daughter, with regard to whom he had designs on me, and I, becoming partly aware of his intentions, was very willing. But while indulging such desires, I made no show of them; on the contrary, I was so discreet in my behaviour that I made him wonder. It so happened that the poor girl was attacked by a disorder in her right hand, which ate into the 2 bones belonging to the little finger and the next. Owing to her father's carelessness, she had been treated by an ignorant quack doctor, who predicted that the poor child would be crippled in the whole of her right arm, if even nothing worse should happen. When I noticed the dismay of her father, I begged him not to believe all that this ignorant doctor had said. He replied that he had no acquaintance with physicians or with surgeons, and entreated me, if I knew of one, to bring him to the house. I sent at once for a certain Maestro Giacomo of Perugia, a man of great skill in surgery, who examined the poor girl. She was dreadfully frightened through having gained some inkling of the quack's predictions, whereas my intelligent doctor declared she would suffer nothing of consequence, and would be very well able to use her right hand, also, that though the last two fingers must remain somewhat weaker than the others, this would be of no inconvenience at all to her. So he began his treatment, and after a few days, when he was going to extract a portion of the diseased bones, her father called for me, and begged me to be present at the operation. Maestro Giacomo was using some coarse steel instruments, and when I observed that he was making little way and at the same time was inflicting severe pain on the patient, I begged him to stop and wait half a quarter of an hour for me. I ran into the shop, and made a little scalping iron of steel, extremely thin and curved; it cut like a razor. On my return, the surgeon used it, and began to work with so gentle a hand that she felt no pain, and in a short while the operation was over. In consequence of this service, and for other reasons, the worthy man conceived for me as much love, or more, as he had for two male children, and in the mean while he attended to the cure of his beautiful young daughter. I was on terms of the closest intimacy with one Messer Giovanni Gaddi, who was a clerk of the Camera, and a great connoisseur of the arts, although he had no practical acquaintance with any. In his household were a certain Messer Giovanni, a Greek of eminent learning; Master Lodovico of Fano, no less distinguished as a man of letters; Messer Antonio Allegretti, and Messer Annibale Caro, at that time in his early manhood. Messer Bastiano of Venice, a most excellent painter, and I, were admitted to their society, and almost every day we met together in Messer Giovanni's company. Being aware of this intimacy, the worthy goldsmith Raffaello said to Messer Giovanni: "Good sir, you know me; now I want to marry my daughter to Benvenuto, and can think of no better intermediary than your worship. So I am come to crave your assistance, and to beg you to name for her such dowry from my estate as you may think suitable." The light headed man hardly let my good friend finish what he had to say, before he put in, quite at random: "Talk no more about it, Raffaello; you are farther from your object than January from mulberries." The poor man, utterly discouraged, looked about at once for another husband for his girl, while she and the mother and all the family lived on in a bad humour with me. Since I did not know the real cause of this (I imagined they were paying me with bastard coin for the many kindnesses I had shown them), I conceived the thought of opening a workshop of my own in their neighbourhood. Messer Giovanni told me nothing till the girl was married, which happened in a few months. Meanwhile I laboured assiduously at the work I was doing for the Pope, and also in the service of the Mint, for his Holiness had ordered another coin, of the value of 2 carlins, on which his own portrait was stamped, while the reverse bore a figure of Christ upon the waters, holding out his hand to St. Peter, with this inscription: "Quae dubitasti?" My design won such applause that a certain secretary of the Pope, a man of the greatest talent, called Il Sanga, was moved to this remark: "Your Holiness can boast of having a currency superior to any of the ancients in all their glory." The Pope replied: "Benvenuto, for his part, can boast of serving an emperor like me, who is able to discern his merit." I went on at my great piece in gold, showing it frequently to the Pope, who was very eager to see it, and each time expressed greater admiration. XLVII My brother at this period was also in Rome, serving Duke Alessandro, on whom the Pope had recently conferred the Duchy of Penna. This prince kept in his service a multitude of soldiers, worthy fellows, brought up to valour in the school of that famous general Giovanni de' Medici, and among these was my brother, whom the Duke esteemed as highly as the bravest of them. One day my brother went after dinner to the shop of a man called Bacino della Croce in the Banchi, which all those men at arms frequented. He had flung himself upon a settee, and was sleeping. Just then the guard of the Bargello passed by; they were taking to prison a certain Captain Cisti, a Lombard, who had also been a member of Giovanni's troop, but was not in the service of the Duke. The captain, Cattivanza degli Strozzi, chanced to be in the same shop, and when Cisti caught sight of him, he whispered: "I was bringing you those crowns I owed; if you want them, come for them before they go with me to prison." Now Cattivanza had a way of putting his neighbours to the push, not caring to hazard his own person. So finding there around him several young fellows of the highest daring, more eager than apt for so serious an enterprise, he bade them catch up Captain Cisti and get the money from him, and if the guard resisted, overpower the men, provided they had pluck enough to do so. The young men were but 4, and all 4 of them without a beard. The first was called Bertino Aldobrandi, another Anguillato of Lucca; I cannot recall the names of the rest. Bertino had been trained like a pupil by my brother, and my brother felt the most unbounded love for him. So then off dashed the 4 brave lads, and came up with the guard of the Bargello, upwards of 50 constables, counting pikes, arquebuses, and 2-handed swords. After a few words they drew their weapons, and the 4 boys so harried the guard, that if Captain Caravanzi had but shown his face, without so much as a drawing, they would certainly have put the whole pack to flight. But delay spoiled all, for Bertino received some ugly wounds and fell; at the same time Anguillato was also hit in the right arm, and being unable to use his sword, got out of the fray as well as he was able. The others did the same. Bertino Aldobrandi was lifted from the ground seriously injured. Note. The Bargello was the chief constable or sheriff in Italian towns. I shall call him Bargello always in my translation, since any English equivalent would be misleading. He did the rough work of policing the city, and was consequently a mark for all the men of spirit who disliked being kept in order. Giovio, in his life of Cardinal Pompeo Colonna, quite gravely relates how it was the highest ambition of young Romans of spirit to murder the Bargello. He mentions in particular a certain Pietro Margiano, who had acquired great fame and popularity by killing the Bargello of his city, one Senzio, in the Campo di Fiore. This man became an outlaw, and was favourably received by Cardinal Colonna, then at war with Clement VII. 48. While these things were happening, we were all at table, for that morning we had dined more than an hour later than usual. On hearing the commotion, one of the old man's sons, the elder, rose from table to go and look at the scuffle. He was called Giovanni, and I said to him, "For heaven's sake, don't go! In such matters one is always certain to lose, while there is nothing to be gained." His father spoke to like purpose: "Pray, my son, don't go." But the lad, without heeding any one, ran down the stairs. Reaching the Banchi, where the great scrimmage was, and seeing Bertino lifted from the ground, he ran towards home, and met my brother Cecchino on the way, who asked what was the matter. Though some of the bystanders signed to Giovanni not to tell Cecchino, he cried out like a madman how it was that Bertino Aldobrandi had been killed by the guard. My poor brother gave vent to a bellow which might have been heard 10 miles away. Then he turned to Giovanni: "Ah me! But could you tell me which of these men killed him for me?" Giovanni said, yes, that it was a man who had a big 2-handed sword, with a blue feather in his bonnet. My poor brother rushed ahead, and having recognized the homicide by those signs, he threw himself with all his dash and spirit into the middle of the band, and before the man could turn on guard, ran him right through the guts, and with the sword's hilt thrust him to the ground. Then he turned upon the rest with such energy and daring, that his one arm was on the point of putting the whole band to flight, had it not been that, while wheeling round to strike an arquebusier, this man fired in self-defence, and hit the brave unfortunate young fellow above the knee of his right leg. While he lay stretched upon the ground, the constables scrambled off in disorder as fast as they were able, lest a pair to my brother should arrive upon the scene. Noticing that the tumult was not subsiding, I too rose from the table, and girding on my sword, for everybody wore one then, I went to the bridge of Sant' Angelo, where I saw a group of several men assembled. On my coming up and being recognized by some of them, they gave way before me, and showed me what I least of all things wished to see, albeit I made mighty haste to view the sight. On the instant I did not know Cecchino, since he was wearing a different suit of clothes from that in which I had lately seen him. Accordingly he recognized me first, and said: "Dearest brother, do not be upset by my grave accident. It is only what might be expected in my profession. Get me removed from here at once, for I have but a few hours to live." They had acquainted me with the whole event while he was speaking, in brief words befitting such occasion. So I answered: "Brother, this is the greatest sorrow and the greatest trial that could happen to me in the whole course of my life. But be of good cheer, for before you lose sight of him who did the mischief, you shall see yourself revenged by my hand." Our words on both sides were to the purport, but of the shortest. 49. The guard was now about 50 paces from us, for Maffio, their officer, had made some of them turn back to take up the corporal my brother killed. Accordingly, I quickly traversed that short space, wrapped in my cape, which I had tightened round me, and came up with Maffio, whom I should most certainly have murdered, for there were plenty of people round, and I had wound my way among them. With the rapidity of lightning I had half drawn my sword from the sheath, when Berlinghieri, a young man of the greatest daring and my good friend, threw himself from behind upon my arms. he had 4 other fellows of like kidney with him, who cried out to Maffio, "Away with you, for this man here alone was killing you." He asked, "Who is he?" and they said, "Own brother to the man you see there." Without waiting to hear more, he made haste for Torre di Nona, and they said, "Benvenuto, we prevented you against your will, but did it for your own good; now let us go to succour him who must die shortly." Accordingly we turned and went back to my brother, whom I had at once conveyed into a house. The doctors who were called in consultation treated him with medicaments, but could not decide to amputate the leg, which might perhaps have saved him. As soon as his wound had been dressed, Duke Alessandro appeared and most affectionately greeted him. My brother had not as yet lost consciousness, so he said to the Duke: "My lord, this only grieves me, that your Excellency is losing a servant than whom you may perchance to find men more valiant in the profession of arms, but none more lovingly and loyally devoted to your service than I have been." The Duke bade him do all he could to keep alive; for the rest, he well knew him to be a man of worth and courage. He then turned to his attendants, ordering them to see that the brave young fellow wanted for nothing. When he was gone, my brother lost blood so copiously, for nothing could be done to stop it, that he went off his head, and kept raving all the following night, with the exception that once, when they wanted to give him the communion, he said: "You would have done well to confess me before; now it is impossible that I should receive the divine sacrament in this already ruined frame; it will be enough if I partake of it by the divine virtue of the eyesight, whereby it shall be transmitted into my immortal soul, which only prays to him for mercy and forgiveness." Having spoken thus, the host was elated, but he straightway relapsed into the same delirious ravings as before, pouring forth a torrent of the most terrible frenzies and horrible imprecations that the mind of man could imagine; nor did he cease once all that night until the day broke. When the sun appeared above our horizon, he turned to me and said: "Brother, I do not wish to stay here longer, for these fellows will end by making me do something tremendous, which may cause them to repent of the annoyance they have given me." Then he kicked out both his legs, the injured limb we had enclosed in a very heavy box, and made as though he would fling it across a horse's back. Turning his face round to me, he called out thrice, "Farewell, farewell!" and with the last word that most valiant spirit passed away. At the proper hour, toward nightfall, I had him buried with due ceremony in the church of the Florentines, and afterwards I erected to his memory a very handsome monument of marble, upon which I caused trophies and banners to be carved. I must not omit to mention that one of his friends had asked him who was the man that had killed him, and if he could recognize him; to which he answered that he could, and gave his description. My brother indeed attempted to prevent this coming to my ears, but I got it very well impressed upon my mind, as will appear in the sequel. 50. Returning to the monument, I should relate that certain famous men of letters, who knew my brother, composed for me an epitaph, telling me that the noble young man deserved it. The inscription ran thus: "Francisco Cellino Florentino, qui quod in teneris annis ad eonum medicum ducum pluris victorias retulit et significar fuit, facile documentum dedit quante fortitudinis et consilii vir futuris erat, ni crudelis fati archbusio transfossis, quinto atellis rostro jaceret, Benvenutus frater possuit, abiit Dei 27 May 1529." He was 25 years of age, and since the soldiers called him Cecchino del Piffero, his real name being Giovanfrancesco Cellini, I wanted to engrave the former, by which he was commonly known, under the armorial bearings of our family. This name I had then cut in fine antique characters, all of which were broken save the first and last. I was asked by the learned men who had composed that beautiful epitaph, wherefore I used these broken letters, and my answer was, because the marvellous framework of his body was spoiled and dead, and the reason why the first and last remained entire was, that the first should symbolize the great gift God had given him, namely, of a human soul, inflamed with his divinity, the which hath never broken, while the second represented the glorious renown of his brave actions. The thought gave satisfaction, and several persons have since availed themselves of my device. Close to the name I had the coat of us Cellini carved upon the stone, altering it in some particulars. In Ravenna, which is a most ancient city, there exist Cellini of our name in the quality of very honourable gentry, who bear a lion rampant or upon a field of azure, holding a lily gules in his dexter paw, with a label in chief and 3 little lilies or. These are the true arms of the Cellini. My father showed me a shield as ours which had the paw only, together with the other bearings, but I should prefer to follow those of the Cellini of Ravenna, which I have described above. Now to return to what I caused to be engraved upon my brother's tomb: it was the lion's paw, but instead of a lily I made the lion hold an axe, with the field of the scutcheon quartered, and I put the axe in solely that I might not be unmindful to revenge him. 51. I went on applying myself with the utmost diligence upon the gold work for Pope Clement's button. He was very eager to have it, and used to send for me 2 or 3 times a week, in order to inspect it, and his delight in the work always increased. Often he would rebuke and scold me, as it were, for the great grief in which my brother's loss had plunged me; and one day, observing me more downcast and out of trim than was proper, he cried aloud, "Benvenuto, oh! I did not know that you were mad. Have you only just learned that there is no remedy against death? One would think you were trying to run after him." When I left the presence I continued working at the jewel and the dies, for the Mint, but I also took to watching the arquebusier who shot my brother, as though he had been a girl I was in love with. The man had formerly been in the light cavalry, but afterwards had joined the arquebusiers as one of the Bargello's corporals; and what increased my rage was that he had used these boastful words: "If it had not been for me, who killed that brave young man, the least trifle of delay would have resulted in his putting us all to flight with great disaster." When I saw that the fever caused by always seeing him about was depriving me of sleep and appetite, and was bringing me by degrees to sorry plight, I overcame my repugnance to so low and not quite praiseworthy an enterprise, and made up my mind one evening to rid myself of the torment. The fellow lived in a house near a place called Torre Sanguigua, next door to the lodging of one of the most fashionable courtesans in Rome, named Signora Antea. It had just struck 24, and he was standing at the house door, with his sword in hand, having risen from supper. With great address I stole up to him, holding a large Pistojan dagger, and dealt him a back–handed stroke, with which I meant to cut his head clean off; but as he turned round very suddenly, the blow fell upon the point of his left shoulder and broke the bone. He sprang up, dropped his sword, half stunned with the great pain, and took to flight. I followed after, and in 4 steps caught him up, when I lifted my dagger above his head, which he was holding very low, and hit him in the back exactly at the juncture of the nape bone and the neck. The poniard entered this point so deep into the bone, that although I used all my strength to pull it out, I was not able. For just at that moment 4 soldiers with drawn swords sprang out from Antea's lodging, and obliged me to set hand to my own sword to defend my life. Leaving the poniard, then, I made off, and fearing I might be recognized, took refuge in the palace of Duke Alessandro, which was between Piazza Navona and the Rotunda. On my arrival I asked to see the Duke, who told me that, if I was alone, I need only keep quiet and have no further anxiety, but to go on working at the jewel which the Pope had set his heart on, and stay 8 days indoors. He gave this advice the more securely, because the soldiers had now arrived who interrupted the completion of my deed; they held the dagger in their hand, and were relating how the matter happened, and the great trouble they had to pull the weapon from the neck and head bone of the man, whose name they did not know. Just then Giovan Bandini came up, and said to them, "That poniard is mine, and I lent it to Benvenuto, who was bent on revenging his brother." The soldiers were profuse in their expressions of regret at having interrupted me, although my vengeance had been amply satisfied. More than 8 days elapsed, and the Pope did not send for me according to his custom. Afterwards he summoned me through his chamberlain, the Bolognese nobleman I have already mentioned, who let me, in his own modest manner, understand that his Holiness knew all, but was very well inclined toward me, and that I only had to mind my work and keep quiet. When we reached the presence, the Pope cast so menacing a glance towards me, that the mere look of his eyes made me tremble. Afterwards, upon examining my work, his countenance cleared, and he began to praise me beyond measure, saying that I had done a vast amount in a short time. Then, looking me straight in the face, he added, "Now that you are cured, Benvenuto, take heed how you live." I, who understood his meaning, promised that I would. Immediately upon this I opened a very fine shop in the Banchi, opposite Raffaello, and there I finished the jewel after the lapse of a few months. End of chapters 46 through 51.
Chapters 52 through 56 of the Autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Lazarus. The Autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini, Volume 1. Translated by John Addington Symonds. Chapters 52 through 56. The Pope had sent me all those precious stones, except the diamond, which was pawned to certain Genoese bankers for some pressing needs he had of money. The rest were in my custody, together with a model of the diamond. I had 5 excellent journeymen, and in addition to the great piece, I was engaged on several jobs, so that my shop contained property of much value in jewels, gems, and gold and silver. I kept a shaggy dog, very big and handsome, which Duke Alessandro gave me. The beast was capital as a retriever, since he brought me every sort of bird and game I shot, but he also served most admirably for a watchdog. It happened, as was natural at the age of 29, that I had taken into my service a girl of great beauty and grace, whom I used as a model in my art, and who was also complacent of her personal favours to me. Such being the case, I occupied an apartment far away from my workmen's rooms, as well as from the shop, and this communicated by a little dark passage with the maid's bedroom. I used frequently to pass the night with her, and though I sleep as lightly as ever yet did man upon this earth, yet after indulgence in sexual pleasure, my slumber is sometimes very deep and heavy. So it chanced one night, for I must say that a thief, under the pretext of being a goldsmith, had spied on me, and cast his eyes upon the precious stones, and made a plan to steal them. Well then, this fellow broke into the shop, where he found a quantity of little things in gold and silver. He was engaged in bursting open certain boxes to get at the jewels he had noticed, when my dog jumped upon him and put him to much trouble to defend himself with his sword. The dog, unable to grapple with an armed man, ran several times through the house and rushed into the rooms of the journeymen, which had been left open because of the great heat. When he found they paid no heed to his loud barking, he dragged their bedclothes off, and when they still heard nothing, he pulled first one and then another by the arm till he roused them, and, barking furiously, ran before to show them where he wanted them to go. At last it became clear that they refused to follow, for the traitors, cross at being disturbed, threw stones and sticks at him, and this they could well do, for I had ordered them to keep all night a lamp alight there. And in the end they shut their rooms tight, so the dog, abandoning all hope of aid from such rascals, set out alone again on his adventure. He ran down, and not finding the thief in the shop, flew after him. When he got at him, he tore the cape off his back. It would have gone hard with the fellow had he not called for help to certain tailors, praying them for God's sake to save him from a mad dog, and they, believing what he said, jumped out and drove the dog off with much trouble. After sunrise, my workmen went into the shop and saw that it had been broken open and all the boxes smashed. They began to scream at the top of their voices, "Oh, woe is me! Oh, woe is me!" The clamour woke me, and I rushed out in a panic. Appearing thus before them, they cried out, "Alas to us, for we have been robbed by someone who has broken and borne everything away." These words wrought so forcibly upon my mind that I dared not go to my big chest and look if it still held the jewels of the Pope. So intense was the anxiety that I seemed to lose my eyesight, and told them they themselves must unlock the chest and see how many of the Pope's gems were missing. The fellows were all of them in their shirts, and when on opening the chest they saw the precious stones and my work with them, and they took heart of joy and shouted, "There is no harm done. Your piece and all the stones are here." But the thief has left us naked to the shirt, because last night, by reason of the burning heat, we took our clothes off in the shop and left them here." Recovering my senses, I thanked God and said, "Oh, go and get yourself new suits of clothes. I will pay when I hear at leisure how the whole thing happened." What caused me the most pain, and made me lose my senses and take fright so contrary to my real nature, was the dread lest peradventure folk should fancy I had trumped a story of the robber up to steal the jewels. It had already been paid to Pope Clement by one of his most trusted servants, and by others, that is, by Francesco del Nero, Zana de Bolotti, his accountant, the Bishop of Versona, and several such men. "Why, most blessed Father, do you confide gems of that vast value to a young fellow who is all fire, more passionate for arms than for his art, and not yet 30 years of age?" The Pope asked in answer if any one of them knew that I had done aught to justify such suspicions, whereto Francesco del Nero, his treasurer, replied, "No, most blessed Father, because he has not as yet had an opportunity." Whereto the Pope rejoined, "I regard him as a thoroughly honest man, and if I saw him with my own eyes, some crime he had committed, I should not believe it." This was the man who caused me the greatest torment, and who suddenly came before my mind. After telling the young men to provide themselves with fresh clothes, I took my piece, together with the gems, setting them as well as I could in their proper places, and went off at once with them to the Pope. Francesco del Nero had already told him something of the trouble in my shop, and had put suspicions in his head. So then, taking the thing rather ill than otherwise, he shot a furious glance at me, and cried haughtily, "What have you come to do here? What is up?" "Here are all your precious stones, and not one of them is missing." At this the Pope's face cleared, and he said, "So then you're welcome." I showed him the piece, and while he was inspecting it, I related to him the whole story of the thief, and of my agony, and what had been my greatest trouble in the matter. During this speech he oftentimes turned round to look me sharply in the eye, and Francesco del Nero being also in the presence, this seemed to make him half sorry that he had not guessed the truth. At last, breaking into laughter at the long tale I was telling, he sent me off with these words, "Go and take heed to be an honest man, as indeed I know that you are." I went on working assiduously at the button, and at the same time laboured for the mint, when certain pieces of false money got abroad in Rome, stamped with my own dies. They were brought at once to the Pope, who, hearing things against me, said to Jacopo Balducci, the master of the mint, "Take every means in your power to find the criminal, for we are sure that Benvenuto is an honest fellow." That traitor of a master, being in fact my enemy, replied, "Would God, most blessed Father, that it may turn out as you say, for we have some proofs against him." Upon this the Pope turned to the governor of Rome, and bade him see he found the malefactor. During those days the Pope sent for me, and, leading cautiously in conversation to the topic of the coins, asked me at the fitting moment, "Benvenuto, should you have the heart to coin false money?" To this I replied that I thought I could do so better than all the rascals who gave their minds to such vile work, for fellows who practise lewd trades of that sort are not capable of earning money, nor are they men of much ability. I, on the contrary, with my poor wits, could gain enough to keep me comfortably, for when I set dies for the mint, each morning before dinner, I put at least 3 crowns into my pocket. This was the customary payment for the dies, and the master of the mint bore me a grudge, because he would have liked to have them cheaper. So then, what I earned, with God's grace and the world's, sufficed me, and by coining false money I should not have made so much. The Pope very well perceived my drift, and whereas he had formerly given orders that they should see I did not fly from Rome, he now told them to look well about and have no heed of me, seeing he was ill disposed to anger me, and in this way run the risk of losing me. The officials who received these orders were certain clerks of the Camera, who made the proper search, as was their duty, and soon found the rogue. He was a stamper in the service of the Mint, named Cesare Maccheroni, and a Roman citizen. Together with this man they detected a metal founder of the Mint. On that very day, as I was passing through the Piazza Navona, and had my fine retriever with me, just when we came opposite the gate of the Bargello, my dog flew barking loudly inside the door upon a youth who had been arrested at the suit of a man called Donino, a goldsmith from Parma, and a former pupil of Caradosso, on the charge of having robbed him. The dog strove so violently to tear the fellow to pieces that the constables were moved to pity. It so happened that he was pleading his own cause with boldness, and Donino had no evidence enough to support the accusation, and what was more, one of the corporals of the guard, a Genoese, was a friend of the young man's father. The upshot was that, what with the dog and those other circumstances, they were on the point of releasing their prisoner. When I came up, the dog had lost all fear of sword or staves, and was flying once more at the young man. So they told me if I did not call the brute off, they would kill him. I held him back as well as I was able, but just then the fellow, in the act of readjusting his cape, let fall some paper packets from the hood, which Donino recognized as his property. I, too, recognized a little ring, whereupon I called out, "This is the thief who broke into my shop and robbed it, and therefore my dog knows him." Then I loosed the dog, who flew again upon the robber. On this the fellow craved for mercy, promising to give back whatever he possessed of mine. When I had secured the dog, he proceeded to restore the gold and silver and the rings which he had stolen from me, and 25 crowns in addition. Then he cried once more to me for pity. I told him to make his peace with God, for I should do him neither good nor evil. So I returned to my business, and a few days afterwards Cesare Maccheroni, the false coiner, was hanged in the Banchi opposite the Mint. His accomplice was sent to the galleys. The Genoese thief was hanged in the Campo de' Fiori, while I remained in better repute as an honest man than I had enjoyed before. When I had nearly finished my piece, there happened that terrible inundation which flooded the whole of Rome. I waited to see what would happen. The day was well nigh spent, for the clock struck 22, and the water went on rising formidably. Now the front of my house and shop faced the Banchi, but the back was several yards higher, because it turned towards Monte Giordano. Accordingly, bethinking me first of my own safety, and in the next place of my honour, I filled my pockets with the jewels, and gave the gold pieces into the custody of my workmen, and then descended barefoot from the back windows, and waded as well as I could until I reached Montecavallo, where I sought out Messer Giovanni Giardi, clerk of the Camera, and Bastiano Veziano, the painter. To the former I confided the precious stones, to keep in safety. He had the same regard for me as though I had been his brother. A few days later, when the rage of the river was spent, I returned to my workshop and finished the piece with such good fortune, through God's grace and my own great industry, that it was held to be the finest masterpiece which had been ever seen in Rome. When then I took it to the Pope, he was insatiable in praising me, and said, "Were I but a wealthy emperor, I would give my Benvenuto as much land as his eyes could survey. Yet, being nowadays but needy bankrupt potentates, we will at any rate give him bread enough to satisfy his modest wishes." I let the Pope run on to the end of his rotomontade, and then asked him for a mace-bearer's place, which happened to be vacant. He replied that he would grant me something of far greater consequence. I begged his Holiness to bestow this little thing on me, meanwhile by way of earnest. He began to laugh, and said he was willing, but that he did not wish me to serve, and that I must make some arrangement with the other mace-bearers to be exempted. He would allow them through me a certain favour, for which they had already petitioned, namely, the right of recovering their fees at law. This was accordingly done, and that mace-bearer's office brought me in little less than 200 crowns a year. I continued to work for the Pope, executing now one trifle and now another, and then he commissioned me to design a chalice of exceeding richness. So I made both drawing and model for the piece. The latter was constructed of wood and wax. Instead of the usual top, I fashioned 3 figures of a fair size in the round. They represented faith, hope, and charity. Corresponding to these, at the base of the cup, were 3 circular histories in bas-relief. One was the Nativity of Christ, the second the Resurrection, and the third St. Peter crucified head downwards. For thus I had received commission. While I had this work in hand, the Pope was often pleased to look at it. Wherefore, observing that His Holiness had never thought again of giving me anything, and knowing that a post in the Piombo was vacant, I asked for this one evening. The good Pope, quite oblivious of his extravagances at the termination of the last piece, said to me, "That post in Piombo is worth more than 800 crowns a year, so that if I gave it to you, you would spend your time in scratching your paunch, and your magnificent handicraft would be lost, and I should bear the blame." I replied at once as thus: "Cats of a good breed mouse better when they are fat than starving, and likewise honest men who possess some talent exercise it to far nobler purport when they have the wherewithal to live abundantly. Wherefore princes who provide such folk with competences, let your Holiness take notice, are watering the roots of genius, for genius and talent at their birth come into this world lean and scabby, and your Holiness should also know that I never asked for the place with the hopes of getting it, only too happy I to have that miserable post of mace-bearer. On the other I built but castles in the air. Your Holiness will do well, since you do not care to give it to me, to bestow it on a man of talent who deserves it, and not upon some fat ignoramus who will spend his time scratching his paunch. If I may quote your Holiness's own words. Follow the example of Pope Giulio's illustrious memory, who conferred an office of the same kind upon Bramante, that most admirable architect." Immediately on finishing this speech, I made my bow and went off in a fury. Then Bastiano Veziano, the painter, approached and said, "Most blessed Father, may your Holiness be willing to grant it to one who works assiduously in the exercise of some talent, and as your Holiness knows that I am diligent in my art, I beg that I may be thought worthy of it." The Pope replied, "That devil Benvenuto will not brook rebuke. I was inclined to give it to him, but it is not right to be so haughty with a Pope. Therefore I do not well know what I am to do." The Bishop of Vasona then came up and put a word in for Bastiano, saying, "Most blessed Father, Benvenuto is but young, and a sword becomes him better than a friar's frock. Let your Holiness give the place to this ingenious person Bastiano. Some time or other you will be able to bestow on Benvenuto a good thing, perhaps more suitable to him than this would be." Then the Pope, turning to Messer Bartolomeo Valori, told him, "When next you meet Benvenuto, let him know from me that it was he who got that office in the Piombo for Bastiano the painter, and add that he may reckon on obtaining the next considerable place that falls. Meanwhile, let him look to his behaviour and finish my commissions." The following evening, 2 hours after sundown, I met Messer Bartolomeo Valori at the corner of the Mint. He was preceded by 2 torches, and was going in haste to the Pope, who had sent for him. On my taking off my hat, he stopped and called me, and reported in the most friendly manner all the messages the Pope had sent me. I replied that I should complete my work with greater diligence and application than any I had yet attempted, but without the least hope of having any reward whatever from the Pope. Messer Bartolomeo reproved me, saying this was not the way in which one ought to reply to the advances of a pope. I answered that I should be mad to reply otherwise, mad if I based my hopes on such promises, being certain to get nothing. So I departed, and went off to my business. Messer Bartolomeo must have reported my audacious speeches to the Pope, and more, perhaps, than I had really said, for his Holiness waited above 2 months before he sent to me, and during that while nothing would have induced me to go uncalled for to the palace. Yet he was dying with impatience to see the chalice, and commissioned Messer Roberto Pucci to give heed to what I was about. That right worthy fellow came daily to visit me, and always gave me some kindly word, which I returned. The time was drawing nigh now for the Pope to travel toward Bologna. So at last, perceiving that I did not mean to come to him, he made Messer Roberto bid me bring my work, that he might see how I was getting on. Accordingly I took it, and having shown, as the piece itself proved, that the most important part was finished, I begged him to advance me 500 crowns, partly on account, and partly because I wanted gold to complete the chalice. The Pope said, go on at work until it is finished. I answered, as I took my leave, that I would finish it if he paid me the money, and so I went away. End of chapter 52 through 56. Recorded by David Lazarus.